To anyone who reads this, please promise to tell my story. I need people to know about this. That's why I'm taking my time to write everything down. So if you come across this, heed my warning. Stay away from Emerald Bay. Let me start from the beginning. The first thing I remember is walking through the woods. I don't know how I got there, what woods I was wandering through, or where I was going. My mind was flickering. I had trouble piecing any coherent thoughts together. All I knew was that I had to keep walking. My clothes were torn. I wore no shoes, and the coarse ground hurt my feet. I pushed strands of hair from my eyes and felt my skin burning hot against my fingers. Noises were coming from all around me, cracking twigs and rustling leaves and growling animals. My head was spinning. My vision blurred again and again. I could hardly focus on what was in front of me as I walked. I tripped over roots a few times and stumbled but never fell. I wouldn't have been able to stand up again if I had fallen. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't change direction once. The woods were stirring. I felt someone watching me. My whole body hurt. My legs were shaking and I expected to collapse at any moment. The fever was burning right through my body and the fried remains of my brain. I heard owls since my consciousness had come back and the noise distracted me more than it should. I stumbled again. The ground came dangerously close, but I gripped a nearby tree to stay on my feet. The wood crumbled beneath my hands and my fingers dug deep into it. I quickly pulled my hand back and it was covered in a dark liquid now, but I couldn't identify it in the pale moonlight. I looked up and saw an owl sit on the ground in front of me. It turned its head towards me and its eyes were those of a human, staring at me unblinking. I stood still and watched it while it was watching me. It shook its head. I heard a low growl right behind me and without thinking, I ignored the bird and started to run. My vision blurred. I saw a faint light between the trees and ran towards it. Hot breath brushed against my back. My feet hurt. I could barely see anything. My legs were shaking. A gunshot rang through the air. I stumbled. This time I lost my balance and fell. Colorful dots danced in front of my eyes. The owl sat in front of me again. Its human eyes watched me curiously before my world faded to black. When I woke again, I lay in a bed. I felt better than before. The dizziness was mostly gone and so was the pain. My skin wasn't burning anymore. I didn't know for how long I'd slept, but I had dreamed a lot. Incoherent nightmares of lightning and fire, the owl with the human eyes, a woman with long blonde hair and darkness. Cold, merciless darkness. I sat up and realized I was inside a wooden house. The interior was sparse, consisting only of a bed, a desk, and 2 chairs, as well as a workbench. Through the windows I could see the darkness outside and wondered if I had slept for a very short or very long time. Awake, I turned around and saw a man leaning against the wall, middle-aged, gray hair, and a gray beard. He wore a long brown coat, a dark shirt and trousers, and black leather gloves. As he got closer, I saw one of his eyes was blind and surrounded by nasty white scars. I stumbled backwards until my back hit the wall behind the bed and gripped the blanket tightly, as if it could shield me. "I won't hurt you, kid," he said and stopped a few steps away from the bed. "Thought you were dead, you know." His words ultimately meant nothing, but I had nowhere to run anyways. I let go of the blanket and let the tension leave my body, at least until he stayed at a distance like that. "What happened?" "Don't know," he shrugged. "Found you out there while hunting, knocked out, burning with fever. And you just decided to carry me home and let me sleep in your bed?" He shrugs again. "You're not my prey. Couldn't let you freeze out there. not his prey. The words made my guts twist. I didn't want to think about what he would have done to me if I were his prey. I shivered. Who the hell are you, anyways? Hunter. Is that your name or your profession? I then asked. Confusion flashed across his face. His unlike eyes narrowed. Both, he replied, but it was more question than answer. I decided to drop the matter since there was still the possibility that I was dealing with an unstable psychopath. He hadn't hurt me while I'd slept, but he could still snap at any moment. I was still weak, had no idea where I was, but most likely I was stuck with that guy in the middle of the woods at night. Not the place to take risks for sure. What do you hunt? I asked and said. He moved and I tensed immediately, but he stayed away from the bed. Instead, he walked over to the table and sat down on one of the chairs. My prey. That, of course, did nothing to ease my worries. Your prey isn't human, right? Human? He repeated and laughed hoarsely. No, not human. A small knife lay on the desk. He grabbed it and began to sharpen the rusty blade. I didn't like the fact that he was holding a knife now, but at least he was far away that I would have time to flee if he decided to attack me with it. He was strange. Either he didn't know what he was hunting, or he didn't want to tell me, but he seemed honest when he stated it wasn't human. At least I wasn't stuck with a cannibal. You have a name, kid? The question felt like a punch to the face. I knew I had a name. Of course I had one. Everyone had a name. But I couldn't remember it. I couldn't remember anything. I knew about the forest, my confusion, the fever, but nothing before that. I tried to think, to conjure up any memory, but my mind shattered at the slightest attempt. It hurt. White pain flashed right through my skull. I didn't know who I was. My breath hitched. K, I finally choked out. My name. I knew my name and everything else was a blur, and I couldn't breathe because I had forgotten everything. All I had was that name and the small vignettes that flashed through my mind, the images of a woman with long blonde hair and warmth. I knew my name. Kayla Chase. I couldn't remember the woman's face. All I remembered was her blonde hair and her warmth, and that I loved her. My wife? Had I been married? I loved the woman. I was sure about that, but I couldn't remember her name. I had dreamed about her while sweating out the fever. She had worn a wedding dress in the dream, so she was most likely my wife, right? The hunter put his knife down. Breathe, kid, he told me. I'm trying. I leaned forward, desperately trying to catch my breath. Amnesia. Goddamn amnesia. I tried to think to remember, but my thoughts were bouncing back and forth. I couldn't reach anything and it hurt so much. I'm Kayla Chase, I repeated. Maybe saying things out loud would help. Got that, kid. I'm not talking to you, I snapped, still breathless. Sorry. I need to collect my thoughts. He simply nodded and turned to his knife again. I'm married, I continued. There was a car. My wife. The image is blurred, but I remember the sound of a car engine. My wife, still without a face, but smiling. The woods. My wife. She had to be somewhere here. I looked down to my hands and basically saw the small silver wedding ring with the blue crystal, even though it was no longer on my finger, lost in the woods most likely. I knew 3 things. My name was Kayla Chase. I was married. I had to look for my wife. Where am I? I asked the hunter. My house. I sighed. This wasn't going anywhere. I mean, listen, kid, he interrupts me. Don't know. You're in my house in the woods. Can't tell you more. I looked at him. An old man, skinny and sickly pale and dressed in dirty clothes, hunting a prey even he didn't know about. He couldn't tell me anything else because he didn't know. Something was so very wrong with this place. Owls had human eyes here. The thing that followed me, was that your prey? I asked him. Don't know. But you shot it, right? He shook his head. Missed. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of the place I was stranded in. Something was off. These woods, this hunter, the prey, the owl, my amnesia. There was something just not right about all these things, and I was still a little dizzy. Thinking about it was way harder than it should be. How long are you hunting it already? He looked confused again, blinked once, twice, and put the blade back down. A while, he answered. Time's weird. Time was certainly a lot of things, but weird was not one of the words that would have come to my mind. Maybe he was insane. It would make so much more sense to think that. Two people who have lost their minds sitting in a cabin in the woods. The owl had just been a dream of my fever-ridden mind, and so had been the prey. I cursed myself for thinking anything else. But wasn't it understandable, considering my amnesiac mind? I pointed at the window. How long until sunrise? Just told you, kid. Time's weird. I thought of someone else who was way weirder than time, but I didn't say that out loud. There was no reason to argue with him anyways. I had to find my wife and get out of here, wherever I was. Or maybe just get a phone somewhere and call the police. Either way, finding actual civilization was my main goal for now. Getting the police involved was part 2, and then I'd get my wife. I got out of the bed and brushed dirt and debris from my body. I need to get to the nearest town, I told the hunter. Figured as much, he replied. Shouldn't be too far if you follow the lights. He took the knife once again, spun it in his hand so the blade was between his fingers and held it in my direction. You might need this. I took the blade from him. Thank you for everything. He shrugged and stood up. Be careful out there, kid, he said and walked over to his workbench. He took the shotgun that was placed there, and I gripped my newly acquired knife tighter, ready to fight him if he decided to do something stupid. But he held it towards the ground. Need to get back to my hunt, he explained, and went outside without another word to me. Definitely insane, I decided. At least I had a weapon now. Most likely I wasn't going to need it, like, ever. But it certainly couldn't hurt to carry it around for a while. I exited the house barely a minute after the hunter had left, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Disappeared into the darkness of the forest, apparently. I turned towards the cabin again to close the door, but it had already fallen shut behind me and there was no light visible through the windows. I hadn't turned the lights off when I left. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I held onto my knife. I should reach the town and get the police involved as soon as possible. The faint light the hunter had mentioned glowed on the horizon, and I began to walk towards it. Cold wind tugged on my torn clothes and made me shiver again. I heard the owl again, but didn't turn to look at it. I didn't want to know if it still had human eyes. The town was much closer than I expected after seeing the distant lights. It was hard to say for how long I walked, considering I had no watch or phone with me, but I wasn't even exhausted when I arrived at the sign that said, "Welcome to Emerald Bay." Did I know this town? The name certainly didn't trigger any memories. Most houses lay dark in front of me. Streetlights flickered and barely lit the road. The town was deserted and eerily silent. Of course I didn't know what time it was, but Wasn't there always somebody outside? Yet the silence was absolutely deafening. I couldn't even hear cars in the distance or something. With the knife tightly in my right hand, I stepped into the road and walked towards the center of the town that was apparently Emerald Bay. There was not a single car on either side of the street, not even parked ones. The houses all looked similar, rectangle multi-apartment buildings in plain colors. Some windows were lit, but no people could be seen in them. My footsteps echoing from the asphalt was the only sound for several minutes, and I got paranoid looking behind me every few seconds because I felt watched, like something was following me. But no matter how often I looked, there was nothing to be seen in the darkness behind me. I only needed to find the police station, I thought. As soon as I got there, everything should be fine. They would find out who I am and how I got here. They would get my wife and send us home, and I could recover from the amnesia with her help. It would be okay. Of course it would be. I still had no idea where I was going. For a while, there was nothing but the road and the apartment complexes and the flickering lights. The full moon stood in a cloudless sky, and it hadn't moved an inch since I had started to walk from the hunter's house. The knife felt heavy in my hand. There was no street signs, no road names, no numbers on the houses. I've walked for a while and had yet to see a single car. I felt like I was in a survival horror game. I had liked them, right? Before? There was a faint memory of me sitting in a living room floor and screaming at a stupid jump scare. And someone next to me, my wife, I could hear her laughter as if she was actually with me. There was finally a corner right ahead of me, and I got a bad feeling. Nothing I could name, just a general uneasiness. The temperatures around me seemed to drop a few degrees as I got closer. There was a street lamp right at the corner, and it flickered so fast it almost made me dizzy. It was still silent. I held the knife in front of my body, blade facing away from me. My heart was racing. I didn't want to go. Wanted to turn around and run, yet I had no reason to. There was still nobody around. I reached the street lamp. At first, I didn't realize what I was looking at. My mind just couldn't process the sight. I was frozen in place and stared at what lay under the lamp, illuminated by the flickering light. It was bloody. Pale but very bloody, clothes tearing at the seams, remains of a police uniform on a broken body, head facing in the wrong direction, eyes wide with terror, bleeding from oh so many wounds, mouth open in a silent scream, face sliced open beyond recognition. The first human I come across in this godforsaken town was a dead policeman. I screamed in horror, disrupting an unsettling silence, and fell to my knees. I coughed and gagged and almost threw up as I finally understood that I was looking at a corpse. My body was shaking like crazy. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrifying sight, just stared at the backwards facing head while not being able to catch my breath. As I finally looked up, I felt my heart stop for a moment. Right in front of me stood a man. A tall man in a light gray suit and gray hat. I froze in place, unable to move even an inch. The man simply pointed at the corpse. I looked again and realized that the policeman held a gun in his broken hand. As I lifted my head again, the gray-clothed man had disappeared without a trace again, as if he had never existed at all. That's when I covered my face with my hands and started to cry. I was sick to my stomach. This town was cursed, I was sure about that. There was a dead man right in front of me. I didn't know what had killed him, and some sort of ghost had appeared right beside me, and suddenly I was sure I was going to die here. I wouldn't find a police station. Nobody would help me here. The moon still hadn't moved. I cried until I couldn't breathe anymore. My memories were still a blur. Hazy and just out of reach, hidden behind locked doors and stone walls. but right between the blurred images and unreachable memories, there were flashes of my wife that were almost clear. Her in a white dress, smiling at me. "You're perfect, Kayla." Our wedding. Her name was on the tip of my tongue. I shoved my hands into my hair as if that would somehow assist in my thinking. Her name. I knew her name. She was my wife. I loved her. Of course I knew her name. Dia. My eyes fell upon the gun in the corpse's hand again. Dia was here somewhere. I refused to believe that she was dead. Not as long as I hadn't seen her body. I still wasn't sure what was going on and how to make sense of any of this. My wife and I had come here together and got separated. I had lost my memory. Now I was in a cursed village in an eternal night. I was trembling, and it felt like my body would give in as soon as I tried to move. But I had to, for Dia. I had to find her and get both of us out of here as quick as possible. I could piece the missing information together when we're safe again. I swallowed my nausea and ripped the gun out of the corpse's stiff hand. Touching the cold skin made me shiver, but as soon as I held the weapon in my hands, I felt better. Without even thinking, I checked how many bullets I had left in the gun, and was pleasantly surprised when I saw that only one was missing. Then it hit me. How the hell did I know how to handle a gun? My memory showed nothing but fog regarding this. I'd asked Dia as soon as I found her, and I didn't allow myself to doubt for a second that I would find her. I put the knife in my pocket and kept the gun in my hands. A vulture landed beside me and looked up. It had the same eyes as the owl. Human eyes. I aimed the gun at its head. It blinked, turned towards the corpse and started picking on the exposed flesh. I lowered the gun again. Wasting a bullet on that thing would be ridiculous. The eyes were unsettling, but that was the least of my problems considering the dead man and the ghost. I didn't want to watch the vulture pick the body apart, so I turned around the corner and walked away. This place was cursed. I didn't even know where to go to get away from here. It still felt like lightning was flashing through my brain. I was dizzy, but I knew two things. My name was Kayla Chase. I had to find my wife. The street stretched out towards the dark horizon, and I tried to remember what a sunrise looked like. The memory was faded, almost colorless. I hoped I'd see another one, maybe when Dia and I got out of here, driving away together towards the rising sun. The gun was cold and heavy in my hand as I walked down the road. There were no cars, no people, just never-changing apartment complexes. I wasn't sure what I exactly was searching for, but I assumed I recognized it as soon as I came across it. My mind kept returning to the dead policeman and the memory made me sick. I wondered what had killed him. Hopefully I wouldn't come across the thing, but I wouldn't hesitate shooting it if I did. Assuming that bullets would stop it, of course. This town was cursed after all. Birds had human eyes here, and corpses lay on the streets. I walked without expecting to reach the end of the road. For how long, I couldn't tell. Quite a while without anything ever changing until suddenly, I saw the man in the gray suit again. I came to a sudden halt and lifted the gun. Maybe it wouldn't do anything against the ghost, but I would try. The weapon trembled in my hands. The gray man, as I decided to call this thing, didn't move at all. Overall, he didn't seem hostile. He just stood next to the door of one of the buildings and pointed towards said door. His gray eyes stared at me. His expression was completely neutral. "You want me to go inside?" I asked him. My voice sounded strange in the silence. He didn't react at all. "Why should I trust you?" I continued. "You could lead me into a trap." Still no answer from him. He had shown me the gun, I remembered. Something about him made my skin crawl, but he wasn't hostile towards me and I needed all the help I could get. Slowly, still with the gun pointed at him, I walked towards the door. His eyes followed me, but he didn't move at all. As soon as I grabbed the handle of the door, he simply vanished without a warning. Seeing him just fade out of existence like that made me jump. but I calmed down quickly. At least he didn't attack me or anything. I pushed the door open, and instead of the stairs I expected, I entered a decent-looking flat. It was dimly lit and completely devoid of any personality, a little like a hotel room. At first, I checked each of the 3 available rooms for possible threats, gun always in my hand, but as it turned out, the apartment was completely empty. The gray man had led me to a safe place. As I was sure there were no threats in my immediate proximity, I allowed myself to collapse on the sofa. My head hurt. I was confused and desperate. I barely knew who I was stranded in a cursed town. My wife was lost and maybe in danger, and I had absolutely no idea where to go. I tried to remember, tried until my head hurt even more and nothing came from it. Fragments. That was all I had. Dia's laughter, her wedding dress, the way she had smiled. You're perfect, Kayla. The car, a faded sunrise. Lightning, fire, cold, merciless darkness. In the woods, when suddenly everything was clear again. I lay flat on the sofa and cried for a life I couldn't remember. At some point, I fell asleep, and when I woke again, the light in the kitchen was turned on. I knew I had turned it off when I had left the kitchen after checking it. It took a few seconds until I had recovered from my intense dreams enough to realize what that meant. Again, my nightmares had shown fire and darkness. The pain I had felt was still echoing through my body even though I was awake now. The only pleasant thing about it had been the images of Dia that were way clearer in my dreams than in my memories. I forced myself to calm down, took a deep breath and picked the gun up. Something was right there in the kitchen. Whatever it was, I sure hoped a bullet through the head would kill it. How did I even know I could handle a gun well enough to shoot something in the head? I approached the door slowly, and just for the fraction of a second I allowed myself to hope that I would find Dia there, that the gray man had led me directly to her. The naive hope was crushed the second I stepped over the threshold. The woman that sat at the kitchen table was definitely not my wife. She was a bit older than me, maybe around 30, white-haired and pale as a corpse. She held a needle in one hand and sewed a white string in a cross pattern right through the skin of her arm. I moved slowly, not taking my eyes off her for a second, gun pointed at the head. "Who are you?" I asked. She looked up, exposing a frail face and white eyes. "Sit," she said and pointed at the free chair opposite of her. No need to waste a bullet yet, I thought, and sat down, still with the gun pointed at her. My heart was racing so fast it almost hurt. She didn't appear aggressive, but just watching her sew patterns into her skin made me nauseous. This had to be incredibly painful, for a human at least. I didn't look away for a second, but she moved faster than anyone could react. Before I could realize what was happening, she had reached over the desk and ripped the gun out of my hand, throwing it to the other side of the room. I immediately tried to reach for my knife that I still had in my pocket, but she held both of my hands with an iron grip. I jumped from my chair. It fell backwards and hit the floor with a loud bang. I tried to free my hands, used all my strength to get away, but she didn't budge. "Let me go!" I screamed at her. "Get your hands off of me, you psycho!" She held both my wrists down with just one hand and picked the needle back up with the other. I should have just shot her when I had the chance. "Have you heard the fairy tale of the girl and the dreamer?" she asked with a serene smile on her lips. "I don't fucking care," I snapped. "Put that needle away right now." She pushed the needle through my skin and I screamed. Bright, cold pain flashed through my arm. I desperately tried to get free, but the woman was too strong. "Once upon a time, there was a girl who suffered terrible nightmares," she began to tell, absolutely unbothered by my agonized screams. "She dreaded every night because she knew she had to return to her horrifying mindscapes. But she had one friend there, someone who stayed by her side and helped her. She called him the Dreamer because he had no name. She began to sew my arms together. The pain made me cry. Tears obscured my vision and I tried to blink them away. She showed no mercy, of course, just continued her cruel work. The thread was thin like a spider's web, but I wasn't able to rip it apart no matter how hard I tried to pull my arms apart. My skin ripped and bled, but the thread was too strong.
She was always so scared, but the dreamer promised her that she would wake up and everything would be alright. He told her that every nightmare had an end, and she believed him. But as the time continued, the dreams became darker and more twisted, and the monsters were cruel. It turned into a hellscape, and she remembered the dreamer's promise. She tried to wake up, but
A gunshot rang through the air and the grip around my wrist suddenly grew limp. I screamed once again, pulled my hands away and spun around to look at the shooter. My arms were sewn together tightly. I held them in front of my body as if that could shield me from a bullet. In the door stood a rather young man. He wore dark clothes and looked disheveled. Dark brown hair hung unkempt in his face. Dark bags were under his bloodshot eyes and he had a short beard. In his hands was a gun similar to mine and he pointed it at me. "You all right?" he asked. "You're human?" I replied instead of an actual answer, mostly because it had to be obvious that I wasn't all right with all these stitches in my arms. He lowered his gun. "Oh, thank God you're sane. I'm Jack Monroe, and who are you?" "Kayla Chase. Kay." "Nice to meet you, Kay," he said and put the gun away. "Can I help you with your arms?" I looked back at the girl that had done this to me. She lay dead on the desk, a bullet hole right in her forehead. Dark, almost black blood was flowing steadily from the wound and off the desk. I turned to Moreau again. "Yes, please." Another human in this godforsaken nightmare. Maybe things would finally take a turn for the better. I dared hope for the best again.